Dear friends, today you're in for an interesting story about betrayal on a construction site. I invite you to listen on my channel, Purple Heart Stories, and please support with a like and a subscription if you enjoy it. Chapter 1: The New Inspector. Jim Reynolds never imagined that after returning from the hell of Iraq, where he served as a Marine, he would face betrayal in his hometown. At 33, he was a successful foreman in his millionaire father-in-law's construction company, happily married to his daughter Carol and raising a son. But the arrival of his younger brother Tommy as the new technical supervisor inspector set off a chain of events that threatened to destroy not only his career, but also his family. Jim didn't yet know that behind it lay a plan of revenge, devised by the people he considered closest. The morning air was filled with the smell of fresh concrete and metallic dust. Jim stood before the crew on the construction site, his broad shoulders and straight back betraying a military bearing even in civilian clothes. 12 pairs of eyes attentively followed his every movement as he laid out blueprints on an improvised table made from an overturned crate. Today we're pouring the eastern sector of the foundation. His voice, accustomed to giving commands under the roar of explosions, easily drowned out the noise of the operating machinery. Jackson and Peterson on the formwork check every corner twice. Myers, your crew prepares the reinforcement. We should start pouring by 10. The workers nodded in unison. They respected Jim not only for the clarity of his instructions, but also for the fact that he could always substitute for anyone in their place. The former Marine knew the construction business inside and out, and his military experience had transformed the chaotic construction site into a well-oiled machine. The work schedule hung on the wall of the construction trailer, scheduled down to the minute like a military operation. Everyone knew their place and task, no confusion or downtime. And one more thing, Jim surveyed the crew, today we're expecting a technical inspection. Everything must be perfect. The crew dispersed to their places, and Jim remained to study the blueprints. He didn't notice when a black Lexus drove onto the site, from which a young man in an expensive suit emerged, one that clearly didn't fit into the setting of the construction site. Tommy Reynolds, his younger brother, whom he hadn't seen for several years, walked towards him, casually stepping over the reinforcement and cables, with a crocodile leather briefcase under his arm. "Hello, older brother." In Tommy's voice there was a poorly concealed mockery. "I'm here for an official inspection." Jim slowly straightened up, his gaze sweeping over his brother's shoes, polished to a shine, which had already managed to get dirty in the cement dust. The thought flashed through his head that it was a strange coincidence to get his own brother as an inspector, but he brushed it aside. This was no time for family reunions. "Do you have the documents with you?" Jim asked, and his voice sounded dry and official. Tommy demonstratively took a folder with documents out of his briefcase, carelessly handing them to his brother. While Jim studied the papers, his younger brother scrutinized the construction site, making notes in a notepad every now and then. His face took on an increasingly smug expression. "Here you have reinforcement laid with a violation of the spacing," he finally stated, pointing towards the eastern sector. "And the waterproofing in the southern corner doesn't match. Before making statements, I advise you to check with the current regulations." Jim interrupted him, taking the latest version of the construction norms and regulations from his tablet. "The reinforcement spacing is maintained exactly according to the project, and the waterproofing is done according to the new regulations." Tommy's face faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "But here the pouring technology is clearly not observed. You can check the work log. Every stage is documented and confirmed by laboratory tests." Jim laid a weighty folder with protocols on the table. The workers, pretending to be busy with work, watched this scene with interest. Tommy nervously leafed through the documents, but there was nothing to find fault with. His brother kept everything under military control. By the end of the day, when the sun was already setting, painting the concrete structures orange, Jim went up to his father-in-law's office. Howard Preston sat behind a massive mahogany desk, studying some papers. His large figure almost filled the leather chair, and his thinning gray hair in the rays of the setting sun seemed almost white. "How did the inspection go?" he asked, not looking up from the documents. "It's all strange." Jim sat down on the edge of the chair. "Why Tommy specifically? He's never worked in construction." "Ah, you're talking about the new inspector." His father-in-law finally looked up, his face inscrutable. "This is the first time I've heard that he's your brother. Technical supervision is an independent structure. I have no relation to their personnel decisions." Something in his father-in-law's tone alerted Jim, but he couldn't understand what it was. Howard Preston wasn't one to lose control of the situation, especially when it came to his company. "Just an amazing coincidence," Jim remarked. "In a small town, everyone knows each other," his father-in-law shrugged. "By the way, don't forget family dinner on Sunday. Carol is making your favorite pie." In the evening, when Jim returned home, the windows of their two-story house were cozily lit. Carol was bustling in the kitchen. Their 5-year-old son was messing around with a construction set in the living room. A familiar scene that usually calmed him after a stressful day at the construction site, but today something was off. "Imagine they appointed a new technical supervisor inspector," he said, kissing his wife on the cheek. "It's Tommy." The pot that Carol was holding in her hands clanged loudly against the stove. Her face froze for a moment, but she quickly turned to the window. "Really? What a coincidence." Her voice sounded strangely muffled. "Are you okay?" Jim put his hand on her shoulder. "Yes, just tired. A lot of work in the office." She tried to smile, but the smile was strained. The next morning, Tommy reappeared at the construction site, this time accompanied by 2 assistants with folders. His suit was even more expensive than yesterday's, and a gold watch gleamed on his wrist, too flashy for a civil servant. He moved around the site with exaggerated importance, as if playing the role of a big boss. "I have discovered serious violations in the ventilation system of the basement," he declared, demonstratively tapping his pen on the tablet. "According to paragraph 4.3 of the regulations." "What ventilation system?" Jim interrupted him. "The foundation hasn't even been poured in this sector yet." A muffled laugh rippled through the construction site. Tommy blushed, but continued. "And here there is a clear deviation from." "Tommy," Jim said wearily, "you've mixed up the blueprints. This is the project for the neighboring building, which we haven't even started building yet." Tommy's assistants exchanged glances, barely suppressing smiles. One of them whispered something quietly to the other, and he coughed, trying to mask the laughter. Tommy turned sharply to them, his face turning even redder. "Check the soil condition in the northern sector." He snapped at the assistants, trying to maintain the remnants of his authority. "Maybe you should study the geological report first." Jim handed him a thick folder. "All samples are documented." By noon, the site was buzzing with suppressed amusement. The workers, passing tools to each other, exchanged knowing glances. Foreman Myers, passing by Jim, quietly said, "Boss, this inspector couldn't even hammer a nail in straight." "Some spoiled brat," Peterson supported him, shaking his head. "All they know how to do is wave papers around." "Quiet you," Jim rebuked them, although deep down he agreed with every word. In the construction trailer during lunch, the conversations only revolved around the new inspector. "Did you see how he looked at the reinforcement? As if he's seeing iron for the first time in his life. And what a suit, a monthly salary no less. Yeah, all he's good for is manning a barrier." Jim heard these conversations out of the corner of his ear, but didn't interfere. He was more concerned about how Tommy's behavior had changed since their childhood. Before, his brother at least didn't try to pretend to be an expert in someone else's business, but now he seemed to have put on some kind of mask, unnatural and ill-fitting. By the end of the day, when Tommy finally left without finding a single real violation, one of the concrete workers aptly summed it up: a suck-up who got a job through connections. The phrase instantly spread throughout the construction site, causing approving laughter. Jim stayed late, checking the documentation. In the light of the setting sun, the shadows from the unfinished structures fell on the ground like silent guardians. Somewhere in the distance, a car was honking. The wind carried the smell of an approaching storm. He couldn't shake the feeling that behind his brother's ostentatious incompetence there was something more, some kind of plan that he couldn't yet unravel. Chapter 2: Troubling Signs. Jim couldn't pinpoint exactly when he began to notice changes in Carol. Perhaps it happened that evening when she first didn't meet him for dinner, citing urgent work at her father's office. Or when a new black dress, too revealing for business meetings, appeared in her wardrobe. Or maybe his military intuition, honed by years of service, was the first to sense something was wrong, catching false notes in her voice during telephone conversations. Now he found her more and more often hastily ending calls when he appeared. "Yes, of course, the documents will be ready by morning," she said into the phone in a businesslike tone, but her cheeks turned tellingly red. She now carried her phone with her even into the bathroom and often checked messages at night, thinking he was asleep. One morning, when she was getting ready for work longer than usual, Jim noticed a new perfume, a tart, sensual scent, not at all like her usual floral perfumes. She began to go to the beauty salon more often, changed her hairstyle, and a special sparkle appeared in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time. "I just want to look good," she brushed off his questioning glances. But Jim remembered how in Iraq such small details added up to a full picture of an upcoming ambush. Only now he couldn't understand where to expect the blow from. Their son asked more and more often why Mom was coming home so late, and once naively asked who that uncle was that she was talking to near the shopping center. "It's for work, honey," Carol replied then, but her hands, arranging the plates, trembled slightly. Something was also wrong at the construction site. First, it was minor things, missing blueprints that were later found not where they were usually stored. Then someone mixed up the markings on a batch of reinforcement, and the crew had to spend a whole day sorting it out. Jim, accustomed to military precision, couldn't believe that his well-oiled system was malfunctioning. One morning they found that the electricity in the construction trailer had been turned off at night, and all the concrete in the mixers had hardened. They had to break it up with jackhammers, wasting valuable time. Another time, someone accidentally flooded the work log with water, and all the records had to be restored from memory. "It's like someone is deliberately throwing a wrench in the works." Old Foreman Myers grumbled when they found problems in the wiring for the third time in a week. Jim nodded silently. He no longer believed in coincidences. Too often these accidents happened on the eve of important inspections or before the arrival of the customer, and each time they threatened to disrupt the construction deadlines that he was struggling to meet. His younger brother appeared at the site like clockwork, always after another incident, with the same smug smirk and notepad full of nitpicking. But now there was a system in his remarks. He seemed to know where to look for problems, as if someone had told him about them in advance. That day Jim stayed at the site longer than usual. The day before, important documents had disappeared again, and he was methodically checking every folder in the foreman's office, trying to find the missing item. The sun was already setting, painting the unfinished walls in crimson tones, when voices came from the street. Through the slightly open window, he clearly heard the conversation of two workers smoking around the corner of the construction trailer. "Yeah, I'm telling you for sure," sounded Peterson's hoarse voice. "It was her car. The same white Ford, and I remembered the number. I have a keen eye. I worked as a taxi driver for 15 years. "Come on," Myers' voice replied incredulously. "Maybe it was just similar. There are a lot of white Fords in the city." "No, it's definitely the boss's wife's car. I've seen it 100 times when she picked him up from work. and yesterday it was parked at the roadside for 3 hours, no less. Jim froze, clutching the folder with documents in his hands. Roadside was known in the city as a place for secret meetings, a motel on the outskirts, where no one asks for real names and doesn't remember faces. And maybe she was there on business. There was doubt in Meyer's voice. Yeah, on business. On Thursday afternoon, when there's supposedly an important meeting at her father's office. And Tommy's car, by the way, was also there. That black Lexus of his is hard to miss. The next morning, he decided to go home during his lunch break. He had forgotten important documents on the table in the living room. Approaching the house, he noticed that the garage gate was ajar, although he had definitely closed it in the morning. Carol's car wasn't there. She was supposed to be at work. The garage smelled of exhaust fumes. Someone had recently driven in here. Jim turned on the light and looked around. Everything seemed to be in its place, but something had subtly changed. He didn't immediately realize what it was until he got into his car. There was a tie on the passenger seat, dark blue, with a barely noticeable pattern of tiny diamonds. He had seen such a tie on Tommy during his last visit to the construction site. Jim took the tie with 2 fingers like a poisonous snake. A light scent emanated from the silk fabric, that same new perfume of Carol's. A lump rose in his throat and blood pounded in his temples. He looked at this strip of fabric, and all the pieces of the puzzle began to come together to form a single picture. The evening at Howard Preston's house always started the same. At exactly 7 o'clock, the housekeeper would set the table in the large dining room. Crystal glasses reflected the light of a massive chandelier, silver cutlery gleamed on the snow-white tablecloth. His father-in-law considered such family dinners a sacred tradition, and tonight was no exception. Jim sat opposite Carol, mechanically stirring the soup in his plate. She looked impeccable in a new dark blue dress but avoided his gaze. To the right of Howard sat Tommy, an important guest from the inspection authorities, as his father-in-law introduced him. On his younger brother's neck was a new tie, an exact copy of the one that was now lying in the glove compartment of Jim's car. "How is the construction progressing?" Howard inquired, dabbing his lips with a napkin. "Tommy says there are some problems with the documentation." "Minor glitches," Jim replied in an even voice, noticing how Carol's hand, holding a glass of wine, trembled. "Glitches?" Tommy leaned forward. "In my opinion, systematic violations of technology are more serious than just glitches. It's strange to hear such an assessment from a person who a week ago was looking for a ventilation system in an unfinished foundation," Jim retorted, and a wave of tension ran across the table. That night he decided to follow his wife. He parked his car in an alley near their house and waited. At 10:30, the light in the bedroom went out. 15 minutes later, Carol's white Ford quietly drove out of the garage. Jim kept his distance, thanks to his military training not losing her from sight. The car drove through the entire city, turned onto the ring road and stopped near a familiar motel. A black Lexus was already waiting there. In the dim light of the street lamp, he saw Carol get out of the car, saw Tommy approach her, saw them hug before disappearing into one of the rooms. The picture was so clear, as if someone was projecting it directly onto his retina. Jim sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Somewhere deep down he hoped that all this was just a bad dream, that he would wake up in his bed now, and Carol would be sleeping peacefully next to him. But the reality was here, in this dark alley, in the light of the neon sign of the roadside motel. Chapter 3: Unveiling. After that night at the motel, Jim couldn't find peace. Every time he tried to talk to Carol, she found an excuse to avoid the conversation. Tommy began to appear even more often at the construction site, and now his smug smile seemed especially unbearable. Jim understood that there was something more behind all this. The whole situation seemed too well thought out. On Friday evening, when the company office had already emptied, Jim returned there under the pretext of forgotten documents. The security guard at the entrance had known him for many years and just nodded, letting him in. In the semi-darkness of the corridors, footsteps echoed off the walls, and the shadows from the streetlights fell strangely on the floor through the blinds. His father-in-law's office was at the end of the corridor, a massive oak door with a sign, Howard Preston, CEO. Jim took out a spare key that Carol had once given him for emergencies. The lock clicked quietly. Inside, it smelled of leather and expensive tobacco. His father-in-law liked to smoke cigars at the end of the working day. Jim turned on the desk lamp, casting a dim light on the huge mahogany desk. He needed to find something that would explain Tommy's sudden appearance in the company, his appointment to the position of chief inspector. Methodically, folder by folder, he looked through the documents in the cabinet. Employee files, contracts, financial reports, nothing unusual. But in the bottom drawer of the desk, under a stack of old magazines, a safe was discovered, the existence of which Jim had not known before. His military experience suggested that the most obvious combinations often turn out to be correct. Carol's birthday, the safe door opened silently. Inside lay a battered folder, tied with a faded ribbon. Jim took it with trembling hands. The first document turned out to be an old letter, written on yellowed paper. The handwriting was feminine, hasty. Dear Howard, I can't hide the truth anymore. Tommy is your son. Back then, 15 years ago, I didn't dare tell you about the pregnancy. You had just gotten married, were building your business. I left the city and married John Reynolds, who agreed to raise the child as his own. But now, when I am seriously ill, Tommy must know the truth about his real father. Next came medical certificates, a birth certificate with a corrected surname. It turned out that all this time his brother was the son of Howard Preston, the man who was now his father-in-law. In the corner of the safe lay another folder, quite fresh, with documents on Tommy's appointment to the position of inspector. Attached to it was a note from a private detective with a report on surveillance of Jim and Carol, with photographs, dates, times. Everything had been planned down to the smallest detail. Jim was so immersed in reading the documents that he didn't immediately hear the approaching voices. Only when they sounded very close to the office did he realize the danger of his position. Quickly extinguishing the desk lamp, he silently slipped behind the massive bookcase. Military training was not in vain. Everything is going according to plan. It was Tommy's voice, unusually confident, without that feigned clumsiness that he had demonstrated at the construction site. The office door opened. 2 people entered. Don't rush to celebrate victory, Howard Preston replied. Jim is not a fool, he may suspect something. Come on, Dad. Jim shuddered to hear Tommy say that word. He doesn't know anything. He thinks I'm just an inept inspector who's trying to give him a hard time. Still, you need to be more careful. Especially with Carol, she might blurt something out. Carol, there was mockery in Tommy's voice. She doesn't even suspect that she's part of the plan. Thinks I've really fallen in love with her. Women are so predictable. Don't get cocky, Howard interrupted him sharply. Remember what we're trying to achieve. Jim took away my opportunity to merge companies through Carol's marriage to the son of the rich Anderson. Now it's time to get back what is rightfully ours. You are my only son, and the company must pass to you. Behind the bookcase, Jim stood motionless until they left. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his temples were pounding. Now everything fell into place, both Tommy's sudden appearance and his ostentatious incompetence, and the affair with Carol. It was a carefully planned revenge, where everyone played their role in a big performance. Already at the door of the office, he heard light footsteps in the corridor. Turning around, he saw Carol. She froze in the doorway, looking at the documents in his hands. Her face in the dim light seemed like a white mask. What are you doing here? She asked, and her voice trembled. What about you? Jim slowly put the folder on the table. I forgot my phone in my father's office. She took a step forward but stopped, seeing the expression on his face. "What are those papers?" "The truth about your father and my brother." He almost spat out the last word. "Although now I know he's not my brother, never was." "Jim, wait." Carol's voice trembled. "Tomorrow morning, Father asked to tell you that he wants to see you at the site. Said it was important, a demonstration of the new concrete pump." He turned slowly. In the dim light coming from the corridor, her face seemed particularly pale. Tears stood in her eyes. "So a demonstration," he said slowly, "and you knew about it?" "Only that my father asked to tell you. He said it was an opportunity to fix everything, to restore your trust in the company." She took a step towards him. "Jim, I really didn't know about the letters about Tommy. Now I understand why my father insisted so much on our meetings, why he constantly talked about him." Meanwhile, Tommy was already making his way to the construction site with the most evil intentions. The night was moonless, which was to his advantage. He didn't turn on the flashlight. He had managed to learn the way to the concrete pump by heart over the past few days of preparation. The lock on the control panel gave way easily. He had taken care in advance to replace it with a simpler one. Inside the panel, the wires connecting the control buttons to the concrete feeding mechanisms gleamed dimly. "So we connect the red wire to the blue and the green," he muttered to himself, getting confused in the scheme that his father had drawn for him. In the dark, all the wires seemed the same, and his hands trembled with excitement. Somewhere in the distance he heard the noise of an engine. Tommy hurried, getting even more tangled in the wires. "I think so. Or not. Darn." He desperately pulled several wires at once. Something clicked, sparks flew. The light of headlights swept across the construction site, and Tommy hastily slammed the panel shut. In the morning, when Jim presses the concrete feed button, the wrong mechanism will trigger. At least, that's how it was supposed to be according to plan, although now he was no longer sure that he had done everything correctly. At his house, Jim didn't sleep all night. He sat in his study, looking at a photo of his wedding with Carol. In the picture, Howard Preston smiled, putting his hand on his shoulder. "I always wanted a son," he said then. Now those words took on a completely different meaning. Somewhere deep in the house, the clock struck 3. There was very little time left until dawn, until the demonstration that his father-in-law was so eager to see even less. Chapter 4: Resolution. The morning was overcast. Heavy clouds hung over the construction site, threatening to break into rain at any moment. Jim arrived earlier than usual. He wanted to check all the mechanisms one more time before the important demonstration. The night's events in his father-in-law's office were constantly on his mind. Every word of the overheard conversation whirled in his memory like a broken record. The workers hadn't yet arrived. Only the security guard was dozing in his booth. The silence was broken only by the distant hum of the awakening city and the creaking of the construction crane in the wind. Jim slowly walked around the area, noting every detail with his usual military attentiveness. Something was wrong here. He felt it in every cell of his body, as it had been in Iraq before an ambush. The concrete pump control panel looked untouched, but the lock seemed to him a little dimmer than usual. Jim carefully opened the lid. Inside there was chaos of tangled wires. Someone had clearly worked here, and had worked in a hurry. He had only managed to briefly inspect the damage when he heard the sound of approaching cars. Tommy's black Lexus and his father-in-law's representative, Mercedes, drove onto the site almost simultaneously. Howard Preston looked impeccable in an expensive suit, clearly not intended for visiting a construction site. Tommy, on the other hand, dressed for work. A safety helmet and a construction vest looked like a masquerade costume on him. "Jim, my son." His father-in-law's voice sounded unusually cheerful for the early morning. "How good that you're already here. Tommy and I want to see how the new equipment works. They say this concrete pump model is the latest word in technology." "Yes, an impressive machine," Tommy supported him, and something resembling anticipation flashed in his eyes. "Maybe you'll demonstrate how it works." Jim slowly turned to the concrete pump. The massive machine towered over them, its boom pointed directly into the pit where the foundation was to be poured. The hopper already contained the ready-made mixture. Someone had taken care of this in advance. "Of course," he replied calmly. "Only let's move to a safe distance. The equipment is new, who knows what might happen." "No, no," Tommy hurried. "It's better to see from here. You're a professional, what could go wrong?" Howard stood next to his son, putting his hand on his shoulder. They were strikingly similar at that moment, the same squint of the eyes, the same half-smile. How had Jim not noticed this similarity before? "Come on, show us," his father-in-law said, and command notes sounded in his voice. Jim approached the control panel. His fingers froze above the concrete feed button. "Press it once, and tons of concrete mixture will pour through the boom. The only question is where exactly." After Tommy's nightly manipulations with the wiring, it became a lottery. Jim turned slowly to the control panel, like an executioner choosing an instrument for execution. His fingers, still remembering the grip of the machine gun in the burning sands of Iraq, now froze above the concrete feed button. Press it, and hundreds of kilograms of gray death will fall on the heads of his enemies. But where exactly will it fall? This is a question decided not by him, but by the nightly genius of electrical installation, Tommy. Memories, like shards of a broken mirror, reflected betrayal, lies, and contempt. But on top of this muddy film, the face of Carol appeared, full of despair and hope. "Step back," I said. Each word of Jim, coined like a bullet, pierced the air, forcing his father-in-law and brother to twitch, like puppets who suddenly realized that the strings were no longer in their hands. Howard Preston frowned, accustomed to unconditional obedience, and Tommy, grimacing wryly, puffed out his chest, feigning courage that he had never had before. "What do you think you're doing, Jim?" Howard growled, drilling him with his gaze. "We just want to see the work of this. What is it? Wonder machine." "Wonder machine, you say?" Jim smirked, and in that smirk there was neither warmth nor forgiveness. "Then enjoy the show, gentlemen." And he pressed the button. A hellish roar pierced the air, forcing the workers to cover their ears in horror. The concrete pump, previously peacefully dozing, came to life, like an enraged beast, shaking in convulsions. The boom, instead of a smooth sweep, twitched like a paralyzed snake, and with a deafening bang, the concrete mixture, as if from the mouth of a volcano, spewed out towards. No, not into the pit, but directly onto Howard Preston and his hapless offspring. "What the heck?" Tommy yelled, his cry drowned out by the growing hum. But it was too late. A gray wave, like an enraged sea swell, covered them head to toe. Howard Preston, in his impeccable suit worth thousands of dollars, turned into a semblance of a cement golem, helplessly floundering in the thick sludge. And Tommy, squealing like a piglet, tried in vain to dodge the impending catastrophe, waving his arms like a windmill. They were washed into the pit like careless swimmers who dared to challenge the raging elements. They floundered like flies in honey, their faces contorted with a grimace of horror mixed with absurd surprise. Concrete, relentless and merciless, filled their mouths, noses, eyes, depriving them of air and hope. Howard Preston, previously confident and powerful, now looked pathetic and helpless, his thinning gray hair turned into cement icicles. And Tommy just screamed shrilly until the concrete finally shut his mouth. The workers, frozen in stupefaction, resembled wax figures in a museum of horrors. No one could believe their eyes. One of the concrete workers, scratching the back of his head, muttered, "Well, well, it seems we have a new type of concreting by immersion." At that moment, Carol's desperate cry rang out. She ran to the pit, waving her arms and bursting into tears. "Jim, what have you done? Do something, they'll die." Carol, like a wounded bird, darted around the pit, her cries cutting through the air like shards of glass. In her eyes splashed despair and horror, mixed with a faint glimmer of hope, addressed to Jim. "Jim, please, you can save them. They're your family." "Family? This word sounded like a whip, awakening in Jim memories of the oath once given at the altar. He looked at his father-in-law and brother floundering in the cement sludge, those who had betrayed him, deceived him, and tried to kill him. But together with hatred and resentment, a wave of compassion rose in him. He couldn't let them die like that in this gray grave created by their own hands. Myers, Jackson, get over here. Need a rope and a winch. Jim, as if awakened from stupor, gave commands. His voice sounded like thunder from a clear sky. He became a Marine again, a commander making a decision in a critical situation. Panic gave way to a clear plan of action. The workers, like ants awakened after a long hibernation, ran around, carrying out his orders. Rope, winch, boards, everything was put into use to prevent an imminent tragedy. Jim, assessing the situation, realized that time was running out. The concrete hardened with every second, turning the pit into a mass grave. "Need to go down," he announced, looking around at the frightened faces of the workers. "What are you doing, boss? There's death down there. This cement will drag you down and you won't be able to collect the bones." Myers tried to object, but Jim's look silenced him. "I'm going down. Cover me." Jim cut off, throwing off his jacket and rolling up his sleeves. He knew he was taking a risk, but he couldn't do otherwise. After all, he was not only a deceived husband and a betrayed son-in-law, but also a human being. Strapping himself with a rope, Jim, like a climber descending into an abyss, began to carefully plunge into the cement chaos. The sludge burned his skin, restricted his movements, sapped his strength. Every step was difficult, as if he was trying to wade through jelly. "Hold the rope tighter, and pull when I give the signal," he shouted, making his way through the gray haze. Soon he reached the floundering figures of his father-in-law and brother. They looked like characters in a horror movie, with faces covered in cement, with eyes full of despair, with hands vainly trying to grab onto the elusive life. "Grab the rope, Howard," Jim shouted, extending the end of the rope to his father-in-law. Howard Preston, as if awakened from a nightmare, barely raised his hand and grabbed the rope. Jim made sure that the grip was secure and signaled up. The workers began to slowly pull Howard out of the cement abyss. "Now you, Tommy." Jim turned to his brother, who seemed to have already lost consciousness. His face was completely hidden under a layer of concrete. Only rare gurgling sounds testified to the fact that he was still alive. Jim grabbed Tommy by the scruff of the neck and dragged him to the rope. It was not easy. The cement restricted movement, and Tommy's weight seemed immense. But Jim, gathering all his will into a fist, continued to pull him to salvation. Finally, reaching the rope, Jim secured it to Tommy's body and signaled up. The workers, with doubled strength, began to pull, pulling Tommy out of the cement captivity. After a few agonizing minutes, both Howard Preston and Tommy Reynolds were pulled out of the pit and lay on the ground, exhausted and covered with a layer of gray cement. They were alive. Jim, after getting out of the pit, collapsed to the ground, exhausted and smeared with cement from head to toe. He looked at the people he had saved and felt a strange relief. He had done what he had to do. He remained human despite everything. The silence that reigned on the construction site was ringing and oppressive. Only the heavy breathing of the saved and the muffled sobs of Carol broke this awkward pause. Howard Preston and Tommy Reynolds, like two cement statues, lay on the ground, their faces contorted with a mixture of horror, humiliation, and, it seems, a glimmer of repentance. Howard was the first to break the silence, his voice hoarse and trembling, barely audible in the air. "Jim, forgive me." He coughed, spitting out the remnants of cement. I was blinded by pride and thirst for power, forgot about the most important thing, about family." Carol, sobbing, rushed to her father and hugged him. "Dad, why did you do this? Why was all this necessary?" Howard, hugging his daughter, glanced at Jim. "I wanted Tommy to get everything he deserves, to take his place in the company, but I was wrong. Jim, you have proven that you are a real man worthy to lead the company." Tommy, barely getting to his feet, approached Jim. His look was full of shame and remorse. "Forgive me, Jim. I was an idiot. Blindly followed my father's instructions. Envied you." He fell silent, unable to find the words. I don't deserve your forgiveness." Jim was silent, looking at these two people whose lives had just hung by a thread. He saw their weakness, their fear, their repentance. And at that moment he realized that revenge is the lot of the weak. Real strength is in forgiveness. "Forget about it," he said finally, his voice sounding calm and confident. "All this is in the past. The main thing is that everyone is alive." Howard Preston, gathering strength, stood up and looked around the construction site. I publicly admit my mistakes," he declared, his voice sounding louder and more confident. "The company passes to Jim. He is the only one who is able to manage it." The workers, as if awakened from hypnosis, burst into applause. They respected Jim for his honesty, for his professionalism, for his humanity. They knew that the company was in safe hands. Several weeks later, Howard Preston officially transferred the management of the company to Jim. He retired, dedicating himself to his family and grandchildren. Carol, realizing her mistakes, did everything possible to regain Jim's trust. Their relationship became stronger and deeper, based on honesty and mutual understanding. As for Tommy, he oddly enough found a place in the company. Jim, showing generosity, offered him the position of guard at the entrance. True, on his very first day of work, Tommy managed to break the barrier, confusing the control buttons. But as they say, to each their own. And if Jim was destined to build houses and save lives, then Tommy, apparently, was destined to break barriers and sow chaos. The sunset painted the construction site in soft pink tones. Jim, standing at the edge of the pit, looked at the world that had just almost collapsed. He had survived betrayal, deception, and mortal danger. But he stood firm, preserved his honor, and saved his family. And now, looking into the future, he knew that everything would be all right. After all, even after the darkest storm, there is always a dawn. And sometimes this dawn illuminates not only a new day, but also a new life. If you enjoyed this story, then support the author with a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your emotions in the comments. Thank you.